trip in order to engage in the activity. We can do the activity virtually, and will that be just as good? And so again, I and my colleagues have done lots of work looking at substitution between virtual versions of the activity and the in-person version. So, but quickly going to travel as the activity, again, myself and Elon Solomon and many others have looked at the positive utility of travel. That is the idea that travel for its own sake is a benefit. And I was very happy to find evidence in the psychology literature for this viewpoint in a general sense. So there's something called the theory of self-determination that says there's two types of motivations to engage in an activity, like travel. The extrinsic motivation, where the activity is the means to some other end. So that's our traditional derived demand paradigm for travel. But there's also an intrinsic motivation where the activity is inherently interesting or enjoyable, and that the psychologists call that autotelic, which I love. So auto meaning self, telic referring to goals or purposes, and so the activity is its own purpose for being, let's say. And again, guess what? They divided into hedonic and eudaimonic. So some people are still skeptical about whether travel is is anything other than a derived demand. They think we want to travel for its own sake. So for them, I like to use the analogy of eating. So imagine that somebody tries to tell you eating is a derived demand. Clearly, it's a disutility. It takes resources away from other things we'd rather spend our money on. It's purely a means to the end of staying alive. So obviously, we try to minimize our eating time and eating costs. And we can laugh because we know that's pretty much not true. We eat more food than the minimum required to live. We spend way more money on food than we have to. In many cases, we enjoy the food for its own sake. It's endowed with many symbolic and hedonic functions, as well as the utilitarian one. So this is not a proof with respect to travel, but it's an analogy, right? And so it seems quite plausible to me that travel can fulfill both the utilitarian and the hedonic roles or autotelic roles, much as eating does as well. So here's the list that we've come up with in other papers on why we might travel for its own sake. And what is the evidence then that this has anything to do with well-being? Well, the idea is if we can find evidence that intrinsic motivations exist, then almost by definition, to the extent we fulfill those intrinsic motivations, we're improving our well-being. That's pretty much what an intrinsic motivation is. And there's ample evidence attesting to the existence of intrinsic motivations to travel, and again, a whole separate talk on the literature and papers on that. But with respect to the impact of an enjoyment of travel on subjective well-being specifically, evidence is more subtle and tends to be combined with evidence for motility. But there's also literatures on the impact of physical activity on health. That's travel, active travel means. And the therapeutic value of movement, even riding horses or dancing. So to an extent we think of travel as movement, there's lots of evidence on its impact on our well-being. All right, so time is getting short. I think we'll have to go briefly. Motility, the option to travel is, again, I think it's a very interesting concept, the idea being that even if we don't exercise the option, just having the option itself has value for us. And Farzad's paper for Tina B last year with the co-author was very interesting and inspiring me to look more deeply into the option value of transit and making me think about what's the option value of having a car sitting in our garage, even if we think we don't need it, but maybe on that rare occasion that we do, we just want to have an option sitting there. So anyway, there's Vincent Kaufman's the guru of motility, and so literature talking about the components of motility. I will again have to skip kind of briefly over these, but there is some evidence with respect to well-being. And here's just a slide to remind me that there's about 10 or so hidden slides where I do talk about a summary measure of travel experience. So this is not one of the 5. This was the satisfaction with the trip itself, but we moved right along. Okay, so again, don't really have time to do justice to this, but I guess I've really kind of scattered throughout the talk some of the issues associated with explanatory variable of interest, namely travel, I list here 4 different ways, and one of which is, actual travel behavior itself is kind of the logical place to start, and so some scholars have tried to argue that, okay, that seeing more trips take place is evidence of, that their well-being is higher because they're getting out more. But, 30 years ago, Peter Jones, very smart scholar in the United Kingdom, was asking from the point of view of well-being, is more or less travel a good thing? So thinking about the business traveler, if you say, 25 trips a year, that's must be really high well-being. Well, that business traveler may think otherwise, right? Or more trips to the doctor, is that better? Well, it's better if it means you've got ready access to medical care, but it's not better if it means you've got a chronic medical condition that you constantly need care for. So it's pretty hard to deduce from just observing the number of trips people make what their well-being is, right? And then each of these we can talk more about, but we don't have time. So, so just closing in, challenges. I think we have the first challenge is comparing apples to apples when we even look at existing work. And with respect to conducting new research, I think we've got measurement issues, causality issues, which I've already talked about. And this, trying to properly assess the role of transportation. We think transportation is important, but here's all the reasons it's pretty hard to figure out what that role is. It's partial, it's indirect, it's long-term, sometimes even hypothetical. And then when you talk about, well, can we even apply any of this to policy, you get a whole host of other questions. Whose well-being? Do we use subjective measures, objective measures? How do you aggregate it across people? Can we forecast it? How do we balance short-term and long-term? Do we go user-optimal versus system-optimal? So, lots of issues, but, even after thinking about all the challenges, we come back to, it does seem pretty important. Some people think it's the point of everything. And so if we did incorporate subjective well-being as an objective function into our decision-making, we could end up with different results. It could motivate more focus on expanding choice, on not counting small travel time savings so heavily, on more emphasis on active transportation, and so on. So of course I had to end with, continued effort will improve our collective well-being, and 3 minutes for questions maybe, I don't know.
Okay, very good. First of all, thank you very much. Time for a few questions. Question?
Pat, how do you deal with the horizon problem of individuals that have different objectives because of circumstance, where you're crack addict, the fact that they have tomorrow's hits maybe make them have very high subjective well-being or objective.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that, and that was this issue here of, short-term versus long-term. So one person says, I shouldn't have to wear a motorcycle helmet, it messes up my short-term well-being. And somebody else says, yeah, but longer-term, it's an issue, right? So that's one of the challenges, and again, subject one person's well-being is another person's disaster, and to what extent do policymakers say, we know what's good for you, we're going to use this measure of well-being.
So do you think that subjective well-being needs to be defined better so that we're not sort of moving between all those different terms?
I think we certainly need to pay attention to how it's defined, and it may be something like telecommuting, where I struggled for years with different definitions of telecommuting in different studies, and finally concluded, there's no way you're going to come up with a single definitive definition that everyone can get behind, because people have different purposes for doing different studies and this and that. So it's probably even worse for something as nebulous and complex as subjective well-being. So I don't know if we can ever say this is the definition we're all going to agree to, but I think struggling with these kinds of issues in a public policy realm may lead us to certain choices that we'll agree to stick with for those purposes. And so, ultimately we'll benefit by more uniformity in some respects for some things, but on the other hand, can we ever get away from needing a little bit of flexibility or ability to tailor things to what our particular interests are? The one size fits all can sometimes
So I think we probably need to stop here. So again, thank you very much for the interesting and intriguing talk.